Hey everyone, welcome to the Staff Engineers Path Book Club. This is the Americas and APAC session, and today we're going to be discussing Chapter 5, which is Leading Big Projects. Tom, you have the first point if you want to get it started.
Yeah, sure. So overall, I think the chapter has some really good advice. It talks a bit though about recruiting people and also assigning roles. So I'm just wondering, like, on a large project, should a staff class be even doing those, or is it more collaborative?
Yeah, I added some thoughts here about like what at least what I've seen at GitLab, and I think there's two sides to it. So there's sort of like projects within a group or stage, and those kind of seem guess more obvious because the people involved are the people in the group or the stage. So it sort of just kind of falls on the team themselves to decide who's working on it. And then there's the cases where sometimes we've had teams formed in order to tackle a big project. And it seems that at GitLab, that's kind of like where we see senior management getting involved and putting together the team. I speculate maybe they are talking to some of the staff folks when they do that, but I don't really know. Um, and then the second type of project is one that includes cross team work. And so the project might start with one team, but then it extends to other teams or needs work from other teams. And so what I've seen here is that the person or people leading the project reach out to those teams, but don't necessarily like name who they want help from. And then it's kind of up to the other team to decide, okay, we're going to allocate one person to help with this project for a period of time. Here are those people. And that's sort of decided within that other external team. So that's at least what I've seen. I'm kind of curious to hear if others have seen other behavior. And then, kind of as a side note, so that's sort of like recruiting people and assigning. But when it comes to like assigning roles, I do think we do a good job of sort of delegating responsibilities and roles. Like I always see, like there's always a DRI, there's always someone that's kind of posting updates, and people seem to know what their specific role is in a project. I don't know if we formally write it down all the time, but it seems like we do a pretty good job. Joe?
And to your point, Steve, I think um, when I read this chapter, like working groups came to mind when we were looking for specific roles on bigger projects. But as you mentioned, like some of these initiatives can come up somewhat organically, or if there is a need. So to answer Tong's question, I think it really depends. I do agree with you that I think it is a lot for staff engineers to spend their time recruiting people. So especially for that cross stage effort. And I think this is where Steve mentioned like EMs um, or higher level could help. But I do think part of it is having enough of an understanding as well of why it's important um, prior to advocating for it. So I'll give you an example of something I worked on recently. I think I actually talked about this a few weeks ago with the CI data partitioning effort. And I know there was a blueprint involved. And initially when I was working with Jigger, she's like, oh, we need to do this. And I'm like, okay. And then so we talked about it in 101 and then we didn't really get back to it. And it was really a lot of it. It was, I have to say, it was his effort to drive it. He's like, no, we really need to do this or else, .com falls over, like, worst case, of course. But having myself understand it better, and then I was able to advocate it better as well, so that we were able to add people. And from that, I was able to have conversations with product, talking about why we need certain people on this initiative and how that's is a higher priority maybe than some of the other product initiatives we have on our plate. Um, so yeah, I think I would also just say it is helpful to lean on engineering management for it, but yeah, I think it really depends on the project.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I take it as like sort of like the staff class is advocating and sort of informally recruiting people, but having the EM that formally uh, kind of handle that is a huge help if for especially for large projects. Yeah.
Yeah, what I took away is that if you're leading a project as a staff person, you do need to be aware that these things need to be done. And the book mentioned like having like a clear, you should be aware that these things need to be done and that someone is doing them, not necessarily that you have to spend your time doing that.
Yeah, I misread that part. Yep.
I think one thing that I thought was interesting that you said, Cheryl, is that like it was kind of like you started out with that conversation, and then you ended up kind of going to product and talking to a bunch of other folks. And so that kind of actually like it reminded me a lot of how they talked about like the sponsorship roles in terms of how some of these relationships work, where um, like the project lead or the staff person like is kind of like pushing the project forward and getting it moving, but then they need like a voice in that management circle to kind of push uh, for it in those and inform people in those other areas. So kind of sounds like that might have been like a little bit what happened there.
Yeah, it is, and I think still it's still the case that product is the DRI for headcount, so that's where that conversation is needed, because I do agree that Staff Plus are able to choose their projects. It is sometimes a tricky conversation when there could be other priorities on products, on roadmap, and we need to sort of determine how best to proceed.
Cool. All right, Tom, you want to go to the next point there?
Sure. So I guess this might be, let me get at my thoughts. Okay, so as a staff plus, you do have a kind of your own OKR or side projects. So I have a long list of protection projects. I'm curious how the folks choose their projects. Is it customer goals or results or improving the architecture? How would you choose those projects for yourself?
That's a really good question. I'll speak of my two experiences. First, looking at the product development side of the org. And I think from that side, it's at least my experience, so not being a staff engineer, is that a lot of that comes from working with product managers and engineering managers to decide like what's important. I think there is a lot of advocating coming from the engineers, depending on the team that you're on, I suppose. Like I know that on my team, we spent a lot of time discussing what was important and why, and like not just kind of like saying whatever the product manager says goes. So that's kind of how we chose products, or I mean, chose projects from that aspect. And then now on the infrastructure side, it's interesting because a lot of it is more, I mean, it's still very like need driven based on customers, but because the customer is internal, it's kind of a little different. So there's a little bit more room for us to kind of advocate for things that others might not like see as much. And so even though it's a similar idea, it feels a little different. I don't know if that makes total sense or not.
One of the things we did in the rate limiting architecture working group was list this was so we listed things that we want, and then we also had a weight of how important that is. And then we just like went down sort of and filled in like we were choosing between 3 options, and like how well each option was able to do, fulfill those kind of those wants that we had. And the weight kind of helped it from like getting in a situation where like maybe you have one option that does a lot of things that actually you don't value as much as some other options. And it was a bit formal, but I think we were sort of I think we didn't need to sit down and do it in a formal way at the point we were at. If not, and I think more than the score, like having things broke down like that makes it easier to make a decision, because you're not like making one correct decision. You're just making a bunch of small lower stakes decisions in a row, and then looking at the composite.
Cool.
It's
That's
also matter of, you've got a list of projects that you could work on, weighing these are projects that would, advance the product versus these are projects that would enable other people to deliver better, faster, more efficiently. Insert whatever phrase you wish to use there. And weighing those two against each other, and as staff, advocating for the one that you think would be most useful to the company, whether that's aligns with what product or management believes in, or something different that would ultimately provide value.
Yeah, I think, kind of circling back to the initial question. Yeah, I think like if you're looking at a list of projects in the staff role, it's kind of like you probably have the ability to like choose to advocate for one or more of them if you really want to see it get moving. And so I do feel like there was a fair amount of like ideas covered in the book about how to evaluate whether or not something is worth doing. And I mean, I'd have to pull up the list, which I'm not going to be able to do quickly, but
yes.
yeah, it
Yeah.
does come out
Goals,
with like,
and so on. Yeah.
yeah, and how it lines up with different resources that you have.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if anyone, since reading that, has considered those variables or resources when taking on certain projects.
I definitely do it
That's-
implicitly, like I'm not like consciously thinking about it, but if I think back about like why did I choose to do this, it definitely can easily be drawn into like I wanted to do this because it will increase my credibility or increase my social capital. Like a good example would be when I onboarded onto a new team, I pick up a variety of issues that I see are like impactful, but maybe like also, I don't know, like visible. And the idea being that, these are new people, they don't know me. I want to increase my social capital these first few months, and then I can kind of switch to the other track of focusing on other things. Yeah, it's interesting to like actually try to like consciously think about those as you're making decisions.
I think about the goal of each project a lot, and that means that I drop a lot of projects because I can't think of, like, objectively, it's not a very good reason to start a project, even though it's annoying to have that problem, but it's bearable. So yeah, I drop it, and then a year later I come back, oh, it's still there. So I have a long list of those things, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've noticed occasionally when I was working at the staff level was, often you're the person that's doing the initial groundwork. You're not the person that's going to take the project across the finish line. So it's finding the thing that needs to be worked, doing enough work to get everybody else behind that it needs to be continued, and then setting it up so that somebody else could take it over and keep it and take it across the finish line.
Yeah, I did like the point the book made about that if you do code as a staff engineer, like you need to be careful to sort of set the standard. And if you kind of rush the coding because you can, and maybe you're not adding all the tests or breaking the AMERs up because you can just bang it out, you're kind of signaling that this is the way to do it in a way that's like really powerful.
It's dividing your time between doing the coding that we all love versus being the force multiplier piece.
Oh, should we
Move
jump
the next
to
one?
part 3? Okay. So yeah, when I was reading this chapter, I mentioned earlier that I was reminded of our concept of working groups. I'm curious how folks feel about managing their time between work and working groups, if you've had experience working in a working group and say work on your teams. For example, I've heard an EM mentioned to me once that a working group, I think it was a Vue.js one, maybe, would actually require 50% of an engineer's time. So I was curious if that's something anyone has come across.
I believe it. I think that's sort of probably close to an upper estimate, but I wouldn't be surprised. So when I was on the working group I was on, we were in a phase of the project where it was like deploying.com, and we were sort of dealing with things in a reactive way. So there wasn't much like new coding being done that was truly planned, or like, a small tweaks here and there, getting things out on production. So I had more focus time. I had focus time that wasn't for like the main package team stuff. So I was able to like focus a little bit more on the working group than I would have been able to otherwise.
Yeah, I think I agree as well. I'm currently in a group that's 100% because of a working group. So anyway, actually, it's a good thing that it can be quite clear like that. I've seen working groups where, unfortunately, where there's too much to do and people drift off instead. And like the vagueness is actually worse to me. I guess this speaks about assigning roles, I guess, being clear about who's doing what. Yeah, because sometimes there's working groups where nobody does the coding, and that's bad because we don't move forward in discovering things. So yeah, it's better to be clear then and realize that, hey, you have too much to work on and you need to drop things, like Haley mentioned.
Yeah, I think it kind of depends on the working group. The one I was involved in, there was essentially like there were the functional leads that did a lot of the coding, and they did spend a fair amount of time on writing code, from what I could tell. But then there were it kind of like there were other roles that were less involved, maybe that spent less time being involved. So I suppose it depends on what the working group is set out to accomplish on whether or not it is a code heavy thing, a process heavy thing, or something else.
Yeah, but the roles are clear, right? So that's good.
Yeah, I would agree that the roles really help with that. And with my limited experience, I've seen that people who are, I think, just a member of the working group, as they're called, will kind of just drift off or just, participate sometimes. But I think to your points, if someone's a functional lead, I think that's when you see sort of more consistency in attending or participating and working on those. Well, thank you.
All right. Does anyone have any other points or thoughts they wanted to talk about from this chapter? I guess one of the things that I found interesting was when discussing like how to sort of like put a project together, there was the like request for comment document. I think that's what it was called. And like that definitely aligns with, we create issues for that or an epic and then discuss there. But what I really liked was that like a lot of the sections were described of like, here's all the things you really need in order to say you're ready to do this project. And went through like metrics, the goal, the people involved, like all of that kind of stuff. And I was really happy to see that like not only did I agree with the list, but I feel like when I've seen projects at GitLab that are well defined, all of that stuff is there. Maybe not just one person got all of that information. It might have been a combined effort, but we do make a point of focusing on a lot of those same items, which I liked to see that.
Yeah, I also like how the book mentioned trying not to use like words like that and like just say the thing again. I try to do that. But I do remember the one time I didn't, somebody did get confused. And I was just like, of course.
Yeah, I found that naming is a good point as well. I think I saw the working group where Sid in particular was like really obsessed about being clear on the name and actually having a definition for names. So that I think really helped reduce the amount of like confusion in later conversations. And then I think a lot of blueprints now have like, it starts with like terminology, like this is the thing, and then it even has like discouraged things where we don't use this other name for it because it's just confusing. So that really helps a lot. And yeah.
Yeah, we had an issue with that with registry, with the router library. It has an option called strict slashes, which means the slashes are optional. And I've really had to break it down, like this is the behavior. And like even if you have one bad name, you need an entire paragraph of text to explain what it actually does.
Wait. Did you say strict slashes equals strict slashes are optional?
Strict slashes means that it will redirect when there are slashes at the ends of URLs that are not defined with slashes at the end.
I see. Right.
All right. Well, we're just about at time. So if nobody has any other items to chat about, then I'll go ahead and stop the recording here. But thanks everyone for joining and excited for next week for chapter 6.